Retro Hangover is supported via Patreon by listeners like you. We do especially like to thank patrons Lyle McKarns, Ashton Ruby, Randall Quiggle, Tony G, Studstill Smash the Milkman, Katie Quigg, Paul Romalho, Raging Demon, JC, Meagan Caruso, MaskedKeaton, Andrew Liguori, Ozzy Garcia, The Retro Vixen, Adam from The Good, the Bad, and the Backlog, Thunderdome Gaming Society, Dischimera, Jenny E, Rick Firestone, ParallaxPuddles, Keith Gasper, Dave Jackson, Eric Gess, Kayla Jackson, Nomad from the Retro Wildlands podcast, Ash Events, and Alan Bingham. Your continued engagement and generous donations are deeply appreciated.
Open your ears and crack some beers. You are listening to the most recent episode of Retro Hangover.
Classic gamers, welcome to the podcast where we assuredly assume awaiting anglers angling attention alertedly. This is Retro Hangover. I am your co-host, Chris Copleen, with, as always, your host, Shane. Pong paddling Dick Dragon! Koski.
You know, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but your alliteration included anglin, which is apropos given that the Atari, I'm doing my own alliteration here now.
Oh,
has fishing derby. There, the alliteration's gone.
Fishing derby, angling, all start with A.
Yep.
I think you're onto something.
I think I might be.
Hey. Yeah, we are talking about the Atari today. Specifically, the Atari VCS, or the 2600 for all you millennials out there, which we are also part of.
Yeah, so probably most of you.
Yeah, I don't see well, we have some Gen X listeners, but probably not the boomers. But you do bring this up to a lot of boomers, our podcast specifically, as Shane has told me. And actually, Shane, you explain it.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon because I feel like of all the questions I've been asked whenever I tell somebody that we do a retro game podcast, the question I get the most somehow is, oh, well, like how old? Like you guys, like, I feel like they're testing me. They're like, well, is it like really like how retro? Like, do you guys cover the Atari? What about like Pong? Like, do you go back that far? Like, as if we don't know what Pong is.
Never heard of it.
I'm just like, yeah, I mean, technically, yes. Like we could.
That'd be a short episode.
We haven't, but you know, we'll get there. It's on the proverbial table, you know. There's a lot of shit to talk about. And, you know, given that we both are, in fact, I guess, elder millennials, I saw somebody refer to it as geriatric millennial today, and I felt myself die a little bit more inside. So that's cool.
It's entirely accurate. Yeah.
But, you know, given that that's our demographic, you know, truth be told, Atari and like that era, maybe a little bit on the back burner for us because we don't necessarily have as much, you know, personal experience. We didn't grow up with it. So, yeah, to all the boomers out there that are definitely listening to this, although I guess with an Atari episode, we may get some.
And Willie,
you're welcome. We're talking about that thing that was cool when you were cool.
Yep. Shout out to Willie from the Grand Rapidians Play Video Games podcast.
There you go.
There it is. We know you play Atari, Willie. And well, we'll get to the other people who have mentioned they played Atari in the past because we have a new segment that we'll get to later.
Ooh.
That you should definitely stay tuned for. But before we get into the topic du jour, we can't say game. Sorry, Ashton. We are going to talk about, as we are wanted to do, the games that we have been playing lately. So Shane, have you loaded up anything on your old Atari Bitbox through your VHF prong connectors?
That is a string of words that no person has said in like 50 years.
Close, yeah. Give it 40.
Okay, 40. Okay, fine. No, I have not. The other interesting thing about that is I did actually go into my emulation station setup to be like, you know what, maybe I'll poke around at a few VCS games before we do this episode. And I realized that I have zero Atari stuff set up in there at all. So that gives you a good indication of how often I play those. But anyway, this is going to be a good episode, folks. But yeah, no, besides that, what have I been playing? I don't even know. I'm really just in a holding pattern right now, honestly, because at the time of recording, Diablo 4 early access starts in, what is today? Today is Tuesday. So in like 2.5-ish days.
Oh.
I'm trying to not get involved in too much. Although I will say I am playing a certain BioWare RPG that takes place in space. No, not that one.
No, yeah. Are you using the PC or the console?
I am using the PC, and it may be because I'm biased because I've played this game back to front at least twice before, but I definitely do not have as big of an issue with the controls as you seem to have.
Okay. So stay tuned for an upcoming episode.
Yeah.
Not the very next one, not main episode, but soon. It'll be a tale from our backlog.
Indeed. But besides that, really just I've been making use of my phone as a mobile gaming device a bit more. I picked up one of those Backbone controllers a couple weeks back specifically for that. And I got to say, I really like it. It's super comfy, and it really does a pretty excellent job of essentially turning your phone into a little handheld gaming console. So I've been playing some Guardian Tales the past several days, which I've been really enjoying. It's kind of like it's inspired by top-down Zelda, but it's a bit more action oriented, I guess. Been having fun with that. There's another one, I guess, Lumberjack something. I don't remember what it is now. I'd have to look, but it's a more traditional platformer, but the pixel art's really good, and it's got a great sense of humor. So yeah, I've just been trying to, I guess, make use of that. Still playing some Valheim with a few of my friends online. We try to do that once a week now. So we are building up our Viking establishment and trying to take down the elder gods and usurp their power, as you do.
Yes, as you would. JRPG?
No, it's actually a sort of open world survival sandboxy type game, but set in Viking times. But the difference is, and I think I mentioned this before, is that it has like an actual goal, which is to like find these spots where you summon these elder gods, or basically, and fight them, or elder spirits, I suppose they are. Even just that little bit of direction does like wonders for me as a player, because I generally don't like those sort of open world survival games for that exact reason, because they always just feel really aimless to me. So taking that sort of formula, but then wrapping it in this very admittedly simplistic sort of goal actually works really well. So yeah, been having fun with that one, doing some hunting, doing some building, some crafting. What about you, Chris? What have you been up to these past couple weeks?
I've been playing a lot of games, so I can talk about them. So unfortunately, I mean, even though this game kind of ties into games I'm planning on talking about here, East 9 is kind of sat on the back burner for a little bit. Hope to get back to that soon. I'm also playing a BioWare RPG set in space. No, not that one, or maybe that one, depending on when you started playing BioWare RPGs in space. I'm not falling asleep anymore, so that is progress.
Hooray.
Yeah, I'm traveling to various planets now, and I am excited, I assure you. I'm also playing Lufia 2, Rise of the Sinistrals. You may have seen me play this on Twitch, and if you didn't, you can go over to our YouTube channel. You can see me play part of the early part of Lufia 2 there. It's a solid game so far. I don't know if I can completely understand the hype quite yet. I'm starting. I won't even say I'm starting to. It's just kind of, I don't want to say it's a basic RPG. It's very puzzle inspired. I want to say it borrows a lot. Well, it doesn't borrow it because it's just, typical JRPG stuff. You have your leveling system. but it seems to have a mystery dungeon element to it, like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon or Shiren the Wanderer. More people know the Pokemon one. So like you go into a dungeon, when you move around, the monsters there move, but you also have to do puzzles in order to advance into various rooms. It's kind of hit and miss for me. So we'll see how it goes, because I did realize that probably the story is going to pick up at some point, because kind of a spoiler here. The beginning to Lufia 1 is the end to Lufia 2. And I realized there's an important character that is not in my party at the beginning of Lufia 1 that is in my party in Lufia 2. And I don't know what to think about that quite yet, or how to feel about it. I think something's going to happen to this character, and I don't know if I'm going to be sad or not. So there's that.
So 2 is a prequel then?
Yes.
Gotcha.
It's super prequel. So it's like a game you probably want to play first, maybe. I don't know. I haven't played the original Lufia. I've heard it's not really worth it. It's like the second one's where it's at. So whatever. I'll find out probably one of these days. But for now, just Lufia 2.
All right. Well, there you go. I mean, I guess, especially given that we don't have a guest today, it's actually kind of strange now.
It is.
Yeah, you usually have a third voice here, but we're back to basics. Although I've heard from some of our more, dedicated listeners that they enjoy that from time to time. Just having the two of us here, like the old days.
It is nice to break it up every once in a while too.
Yeah. But the reason I was bringing that up is because I think we've somewhat minimized the waffling, maybe, kind of.
Ooh, it's not as Belgium.
Yeah.
Belgian? Not Belgium,
yeah.
Belgian.
It's not as Belgium. Maybe a little more Poland. I don't know.
I'm college educated, everybody. I hope you understand that.
We have degrees.
We do.
Anyway.
I'm cum lady.
I suppose we should probably talk about what we're here to discuss, which is not a game. We are doing a console episode, which we haven't done for a little bit, at least. It's been a minute. One of these days, we're going to get around to another like industry profile on a figure, but we'll get to that someday.
My figure, baby.
Today, we are talking about the Atari VCS, or perhaps more commonly known as the 2600, the one to give you the brief, maybe not so brief history is Chris. So Chris, please take it away.
Of course. In 1972, the video game industry, well, it wasn't really even an industry quite yet. While various laboratories and universities had been experimenting with images on display with Birdie and the Brain in 1950 and Tennis for Two in 1958, but these weren't things that were necessarily available to the public at large. Meanwhile, while arcades existed, the machines people were interacting with weren't images on a screen, but rather electromechanical games. Then, in 1971, Computer Space by Syzygy, owned and operated by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, a game based heavily off a game Bushnell played at the University of Utah Computer Lab called Space War, became the first commercially available video game arcade machine. While not incredibly successful, a year later in 1972, Bushnell and Dabney would formally incorporate their partnership, dubbing it Atari, and release a game that would change electronic gaming forever with Pong. It was in the same year that gaming would make its way into living rooms far and wide with the very first home console, the Magnavox Odyssey. Soon after the release of the Odyssey, other electronics companies would attempt to make their own home releases, but mostly to capitalize on the success of Pong. These were called Pong clones and, you guessed it, allowed people to play Pong. Among companies that made these systems were Nintendo and Sega, of all. Then, in 1976, developer Gerald Jerry Lawson designed individual cartridges that would contain ROMs that could be run by a standalone unit with a microprocessor. In other words, the swappable cartridge. This would apply to the Fairchannel F, a system released in November of 1976. Atari would take notice, as they had been trying to move into the home as well, starting with their 1975 Pong console. They had already been laying the foundation of finding a processor in MOS Technologies' 6507 chip in October of 1975. Atari would begin to develop their new home device with the vision of playing their arcade releases on it. It would hire people that oversaw the design and release of the Fairchild Channel F, with Gene Landrum for marketing and Douglas Hardy for cartridge design. Around this time, Warner Communications was looking to expand into the gaming market, and Atari was in need of an influx of cash, especially to develop a new console. As such, Warner would end up buying Atari for $28 million in October of 1976, and then followed up by providing $120 million towards development of the burgeoning home console, which at this time was still codenamed Stella. That cash flow allowed Atari to speed up development, and by early 1977, they had officially begun prepping the console for release and branding it with the official name being given: the Atari Video Computer System, or VCS for short. On June 4th, 1977, at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, the Atari VCS was showcased to the public. The system would be released later that year in September for the price of $199, similar to $983 in 2023 money, and would come with 2 controllers and the game Combat. 8 additional games would be released at launch, most of which were based on or similar to Atari's arcade releases. These other games would be Air Sea Battle, Basic Math, Blackjack, Indy 500, Starship, Street Racer, Surround, and Video Olympics. In the 3 remaining months, the VCS was a minor hit, selling between 350 and 400,000 units. However, the next 2 years would fall below expectations and estimates. In all of 1978, Atari only moved 550,000 units out of the 800,000 they manufactured. 1979 would fare better, with 1 million units sold, but Mattel and Magnavox would come out with more powerful hardware to compete with the Intellivision and Odyssey 2. Fortunately for Atari, they were able to negotiate with Taito in order to develop the first licensed arcade conversion for a home console, the 1978 arcade smash hit Space Invaders. Sales would double for 1980 and then double again in 1981 and 1982. By the end of 1982, Atari had moved 10 million consoles in the United States and saw the release of another popular arcade conversion with Pac-Man. While Pac-Man is now considered a disappointment compared to its arcade release, still managed to sell 8 million copies and propel the VCS, now renamed the 2600, to over 12 million units in the US alone. However, by 1983, the North American gaming market had infamously begun to collapse. Atari failed to meet expectations, causing investors to pull out of gaming, especially with the failure of the 5200, the 2600's successor. There are many reasons that are believed to be the cause of this, but one of the most prevailing theories was that Atari lacked sufficient quality control over releases on their console, in addition to a flood of competition which included third-party clone consoles, resulting in market oversaturation. Atari, with the exception of their arcade division, would be sold to Jack Tramiel in 1984 for roughly $240 million. This sale resulted in the almost immediate halt of 2600 development. While Atari would attempt to enter the market again by 1986 with a redesigned 2600 and a backwards-compatible 7800, Nintendo had established itself as the industry juggernaut, leaving the now woefully underpowered console well in the past. All in all, the first major successful console managed to sell 20 million units worldwide, more than the Wii U, and have games officially released until 1990, while being officially discontinued on January 1st, 1992. And that is your brief history of the Atari VCS.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris, for that brief history. Man, it is going to be really easy for us to just slip into talking perhaps more about Atari itself and less about the console, because that in and of itself is a fucking wild story.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a story for another episode.
I just want everyone to know, too, there's a lot of history that did not go into the brief history. The brief history was truly a brief one. There's no way we could have covered everything. There's going to be people that we didn't name and developments that we didn't mention, like how Atari was going to go with Motorola first in order to form the console. Yeah, like there's a huge rabbit hole that I'm sure that, like, if you just want the entire history of the console, you could probably find it on YouTube. We're just here to kind of talk about what we think of the console as a whole. Yeah, but we hope we gave you some good information as we usually do.
Well, I mean, hopefully. I mean, like I've said before, it's don't say you'd ever learned anything from the Retro Hangover podcast.
We try to be entertaining. So we'll kick this off just like we do with most of our games. And I have to ask you, Shane,
yes,
what's your personal experience with the Atari VCS 2600, whatever you want to call it?
Oh, man. So my experience with the 2600 is that it came well before my time. I always viewed the 2600 because I mean, I'm sure some people probably cared, but I didn't give a shit about anything after the 2600 anyway. But like, sorry, the 8 Jaguar fans out there, it always seemed to me like this strange curiosity. It was like it felt like a novelty in a way, because, growing up as somebody who had the Super Nintendo and the N64 as like really the two main consoles that defined like my childhood, that was already far and beyond, technically speaking, like anything that the 2600 had done. And so to go back to it, I think novelty is really the best way that I can describe it, because that's really what it felt like to me. Because at the time, playing something like, Missile Command, or what was the name of that racing game that was on there, like Enduro or something like that?
They may have had a racing game called Enduro, but I think Pole Position was on there, like a very rudimentary version of it.
Yeah. But there's that one. I think it's Enduro. I don't know. I have to look it up. I'm sure somebody can correct me. But at any rate, if you look at that game and the way that it obviously is calculating the road that you're driving down in that, sort of front facing fashion, it's definitely doing some like randomized math to like kind of make that work. And that's the same thing that I could do on my TI-83 calculator, So like I was playing games that were roughly equivalent to Atari 2600 games on a calculator. Oh, okay. Chris just posted it up for me. So I was right. It is called Enduro. So to like go back and look at it as like a full-fledged console, it was always kind of like, oh, well, that's neat, I guess. And I could never play any 2600 game for maybe more than, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes tops. And then I'd be like, all right, well, I got the gist of this, and it just didn't hold my interest. And I don't even think that's not an indictment against the console whatsoever. If anything, it's more of just a commentary on me and the environment that I grew up in and what I had. Like, I was already used to Super Mario World. Like, how was I going to be engrossed in, like I said, fucking Space Invaders, right? So
right,
that really sort of encapsulates a lot of my experience with the 2600. I mean, frankly, the most experience I think I've had with it personally is not even a legit 2600, but one of the, probably several sort of plug and play, 50 games in one Atari consoles, I say in air quotes, that you could buy, at a department store for like $40 or whatever. And it comes with all the games pre-installed and everything. I actually had one of those for a while. I think I might have re-gifted that to my parents one Christmas, because I was like, you guys are old. You like this stuff.
Yeah.
Part of that was because I knew that my dad liked Centipede, and I knew that was on there. So, but anyway, that's kind of it. I don't know. What about you? Like, did you have more of like a real personal experience with the VCS?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Well, great, Grandpa. Tell me all about it.
So, as I think I've mentioned on the show before, so I'll bring it up again. Every New Year's Eve, we would go up to Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, and we have the like little New Year party. And what I'd be doing at these New Year's party was essentially just playing video games with all the kids that were there. Because of course we couldn't get drunk because we were too young. You know, it is what it is. Too bad. Say that half jokingly. Why even bring that up? Kids shouldn't drink. Don't feed your kids alcohol. It's wrong, especially in the womb. Well, that's your choice. Anyway, why am I getting off track here? So we would go up and we would play. They would have an Atari. Like they would still have a Nintendo. They would have a Super Nintendo. But, you know, we went up there in the days before the Super Nintendo came out. So that was one of the options. Is they had an Atari 2600 VCS hooked up. And, you know, we would play games on it. Like we would play Space Invaders. We would play Donkey Kong. That was another one. I think another one was Defender. I think we definitely played Pac-Man as well. So like all the big games that you think of when you hear of the Atari, I think I've even tried E.T. if my memory serves me correctly. But yeah, we would play the hell out of that Atari. We just keep on rotating that controller. Remember, it's this like small little corner room, you know, carpeted with a lazy boy in the corner, a refrigerator with all these Coke memorabilia with Santa all over it. I don't know if it was seasonal or they just always had it like that down there. And then the other room, there's a ping pong table, like a very, very 80s, maybe late 70s inspired atmosphere. And yeah, we would play the shit out of that Atari, man. I never had an Atari in the house. There was never really any reason for it because, I mean, I already had an NES. The console came out before my time. You know, just pretty much ceased to exist in 1983. So I'm assuming that they had their console before 1983. Their kids were older than me. So that would make sense if they're trying to get a console for their kids, or maybe they were just interested in tech. I don't know. Just never came up when we went to these parties. And my dad was super interested in tech. And I don't know why he never picked it up because that's supposedly the reason he got me an NES in Christmas of 1989. I don't know why I never had one, but my neighbor did. When I was 5 in 1990, we moved locations, and my neighbor, who I was going to preschool with, and, you know, a lot through my elementary school with all the way through high school, like we were really good friends through all that time. He had an Atari, and I would go over there, and occasionally we'd play Atari too. In fact, we'd make a game out of it. We'd take the Atari controller and we put it in the Sega Genesis because they're both 9-pin connectors, and we'd play Mortal Kombat with each other, and we'd see who would win playing with the original Atari joysticks and the single button. And yeah, it was a great time, man. It does. Yeah. And you can use the Sega Genesis controller on the Atari as well.
That's crazy.
It is.
So I feel like the most important question here is the carpeting that you mentioned at that house.
Yeah.
Was it shag carpet?
I don't fucking remember. Probably should be. Well, it shouldn't be because we're all kids in there, Shane. Get your head out of the fucking gutter.
What are you talking about? I'm just talking about some nice shag carpet.
It was comfortable, man. You could lay down on it. Yeah. It was a good time.
All right.
I don't know why it'd be a good time. You were sleeping, but yeah, playing the game was a good time. Not the carpet.
Okay, well, you clearly had way more experience with this than I did, but that's cool. I'm glad that we have that perspective.
Yeah, I loved. I mean, I don't want to say I loved it. It's just whenever I played it, I had a pretty good time. Getting it to work was always a son of a bitch, especially when the years went by and TVs improved. Because I think that's where I learned how to hook it up via the VHF prongs. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen them.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
In case you don't know, because a lot of people don't, I would even say our age, there used to be these little switch boxes. Now, the Atari itself has like a prong. It doesn't look like an AV cable, like for a composite or a component, you know, you put in one of your video signals. Except this cable contains all of your video signal and audio, like audio and video signal, contains it all in one thing. And so what you're supposed to do is, because this won't plug in directly to your TV. TVs were never meant to take the signal. You're supposed to plug this into a switch box. And so the switch box would also have another input for your antenna that came in from the outside that you'd use to watch over the air TV channels over the radio. And so you'd plug your Atari into one side, you'd plug the antenna into the other side and have a switch for TV and game. Now there'd be two output switches. One would be your coax, which, you know, we still have to this day, more or less. It's gone out in terms of video games. Like no one uses that shit for video games. So like it's HDMI all the way. Like you take that coax cable and you could plug it in if that's the way that your TV took it. If your TV didn't have coax, like it was super old and it didn't have coax, there's these prongs. They look like little pitchforks, and there'd be two screws on the back of the TV. You'd have to unscrew it and you'd have to put each prong into each one of those screws and then screw it down so the prongs stayed up against the TV. So they're like little hooks in there.
Yeah.
And those are called your VHS interface. The picture quality, I'm sure, looked like shit. But when, it's not, when you don't have much else to look at, we probably didn't care. I don't remember caring. Like, wow, this is totally not SCART. Where's my component? Why is this not running at 60 frames per second in 1080p or glorious 4K? Like, no, it wasn't that way at all.
Well, I think the first thing that actually comes to mind for me on that is just how like wildly dangerous that sounds. Like I know it's not really, but when you just think about that, you're like, yes, take these two bare metal prongs and like hook them to these two bare metal screws on the back of these electronic devices. Yeah.
Perfectly normal.
Totally fine.
Yeah. And you would do it as like 8 years old, 7, 8 years old.
Yeah.
Well, younger than that. Yeah.
I mean, whatever. Cars didn't have seatbelts back then. It was a different time.
I mean, you couldn't knock over the TV back then either if you were 7 or 8 years old, because the TV weighed like 500 pounds. So
I was going to say, yeah, nobody worried about whether the TV broke. They were worried about whether you'd get killed.
Yeah.
I think it would crush you.
And the economy was good enough. He died. We'll just have another one.
The good old days.
The good old days. Get me another beer. But I guess we should get into some of the games here and just what we think about the games overall, Shane.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you, like, you did mention some of them. You did mention Centipede. Your dad more liking Centipede.
Mm-hmm.
Have you happened to have what's the word for it? The privilege for playing some of these old games, and what'd you think about them?
I did. Yeah. I mean, I won't say that they're necessarily like, I'm not going to keep it to like exclusives or whatever the fuck, because nobody's got time for that. And anyway, a lot of that was sort of cross platform with arcade, whatever. So I will say that I feel like I kind of got shafted a little bit, because in sort of prepping for this episode, I was looking a little bit more in depth into the 2600 library, and seems like there's actually some pretty decent titles in there that I never knew existed. My exposure to it was really a lot of the sort of just typical ones that I think a lot of people would expect, although I did play some Qbert, partially because I think that was one of the arcade machines that one of the places that I went to when I was a kid had. So that was just something I recognized. I did play Missile Command, even though, truth be told, I've never actually really liked Missile Command all that much.
Not with the joystick.
No. I mean, if you're playing it with the roller ball, that's like a different story.
Gotta have a trackball.
Yeah, I don't know. The trackball definitely helps, but I guess I never really was a huge fan of the mechanics behind Missile Command. Like, I can appreciate the strategy of trying to place your missiles at the right spot so that the explosion will take out the missiles falling down or whatever. But I don't know. Never a huge fan of that. But at any rate, yeah, let's see. What are the other ones that kind of stood out to me? I mean, obviously Centipede, we mentioned that. Breakout, everybody's played Breakout. I think an interesting one actually was Solaris. Yeah. And the cool thing about that is, well, originally it was supposed to be based on The Last Starfighter, but that didn't happen.
Oh, yeah, that game looks phenomenal. I just looked it up and now I know what you're talking about. It's a beautiful game.
Yeah. It's hard as fuck. But like, even today, I think it looks really cool. Like the what they did with the limited, technology and color palette that they had, it was very clear that they had an artistic sort of vision to it, because they really did make use of it in a way that still makes the game look really good today for what it is. And I mean, the other part of it is just like the sort of space combat sim nature of it was not something that was super common. This was like Star Fox before Star Fox in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I mean, Solaris, I think, was a later effort as well, because you were definitely not seeing anything that looked like Solaris within the first couple of years that the Atari was out.
No,
you were seeing, more of your really basic like combat or boxing or just something very, very rudimentary. Like the amount of effort that went in putting Solaris together is insane. And I know there's been homebrew that's come out, like the Halo D-Make.
Yes.
2600 D-Make.
Yeah.
Which actually looks and plays really fucking good. what you can get out of the 2600, considering that it came out in 1977. Remember, this is 6 years before the Famicom came out in Japan, 8 years before that the NES came out in the United States. And granted, yes, this was a damn near $1,000 investment in today's money.
Yeah.
So you do,
that price tag is crazy.
Well, you as a family unit, and rightfully so, should be thinking that this system is going to wow you.
Right.
And so there should be a little bit of lasting power. I mean, obviously, no, it's not as powerful as the NES/Famicom or as powerful as like the ColecoVision, which came a little bit later and ended up being a competitor, or even the Intellivision. It's not as powerful as any of those. But what it does do very well is just have the ability to make developers do something simplistic. I think that's what I see out of the Atari 2600 is like when it tries to get too cute with its arcade counterparts, it kind of fails a little bit. So like Donkey Kong's a bad version of it. Pac-Man is a bad version. But then you have games that a lot of people love to talk about, like Yar's Revenge, which I think is an Atari exclusive. River Raid, which started on the Atari 2600. Defender actually came over and was a very good conversion, as was Space Invaders. And I don't think anyone should discredit Pitfall. I think Pitfall is actually a very big milestone when it comes to gaming, when you consider, you know, what platforming is and how it led up to what Mario Brothers eventually became, you know, refining it and getting it down to science. And in the Super Mario Brothers case, like there's a lot of potential here. And I think it was more powerful. You might have seen developers try to do something more graphically cute as the system, you know, kind of got long in the tooth moving into 80, 81, 82. But you did see a lot of big efforts. You even saw like what's the game that had the Easter egg in it? Ready Player One. Was that Adventure?
Possibly.
I'm going to look like an asshole here, but you had games that were more fleshed out, like Adventure, like Haunted House, like E.T., like Raiders of the Lost Ark. So like they weren't all these arcade sims, which I do think is still the strength of the Atari 2600. But what you said earlier, Shane, as well, which is a great point, is like you play it for 15 minutes, you get tired of it and you move on. You say that's like a fault of you. I actually think the games were kind of designed not necessarily to do that, but like if it could keep you occupied for 15 to 20 minutes, then it achieved its goal, because that was just kind of what gaming was when at least I was a kid. Like you play a video game for a little while, you turn it off, you go back outside. Like that was just more of the mantra of the era.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I think you're right, especially with the, you know, just arcade conversions. That makes a lot of sense. But there are some titles on the VCS that I got the sense they wanted you to put more time into it. But part of it was also, the other part of it is they're very obtuse. When you start to stray away from the more, you know, straightforward arcade port style games of just like you shoot the things with your spaceship or what have you, things get a little bit more esoteric. Like you were talking about, you know, Haunted House or Raiders of the Lost Ark and things like that, which are trying to be these like adventure games. And while trying might be a little reductive, they are adventure games, but with the limited capability of the console, and also being someone that was kind of going backwards, you know, from something like a Super Nintendo and, you know, early Windows PCs and things like that, it was difficult for me to really get invested in a longer form game like that on a console like the VCS, just because frankly, part of it's the graphics. Like, it's just like, it's really hard to get immersed in something when Indiana Jones is a stick with a hat, you know. The other part of it is just because it was like very obtuse and obscure if you didn't read the instruction manuals beforehand and get this like, you know, preamble to like, this is how you're supposed to play this game and this is what all this shit actually means. It's really difficult to just sort of like go into one of these games cold and get a good experience out of it, I think. Because like I tried to do that with Haunted House because I was just like, oh, this seems like this would be cool. I bet it's a pretty straightforward little thing. This should be fun. And I was just fucking lost like the whole time.
Yeah. And you have to remember, this is also the era too, if you wanted to do something more complicated. Gaming was still so much in its primacy that the difference between what PC gaming was and what console gaming was hadn't really formed its own identity yet.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say they separated, because they did separate for the most part, I think, even at this time, because the PC is where you had like the keyboard inputs, like your rogues, your zorks, stuff like that.
Right.
Whereas the console had more the graphical presentation. But the idea behind, if you're going to get into a more detailed game, that you expect people to dive into an instruction manual and read what's going on about it before getting into it, that expectation was probably very much in that mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like when you got to the N64 era, I remember when I opened up Mario 64, the first thing I did was throw that motherfucker in the console and just went vroom. It wasn't about reading the manual. You know, you got to that later. It's still nice to have that manual to like figure out like the minutia of everything. But for the most part, I think even most of us as kids, we took that game out, we slammed it at the console, and then if we ran into any problems, then we'd read the manual. It was never the other way around.
Exactly. And I think that was a big stumbling block for me to really, like, I guess, appreciate what some of these games were really doing. Like I said, beyond just the very straightforward ones like, you know, Space Invaders and things like that. Speaking of Space Invaders, I feel like we really ought to mention, it's fascinating to me, and this crosses a little bit into the wider Atari story, but I'm going to keep that separate. But Space Invaders, in a lot of ways, is the reason that the VCS is what it is, or what it became. Because prior to that, I mean, I think it was, I want to say the VCS had been out for, I think, like 2 years ish before Space Invaders happened for the console. And by and large, nobody really gave a shit about the VCS. Like, sales weren't great. I mean, they weren't abysmal, but they weren't fantastic. And it wasn't until Atari was able to secure the exclusive license to create the home version of Space Invaders, which in the arcades was just doing fucking gangbusters at that time. That is what really put the 2600 on the map. So you can say what you want about it, because I'll say, like, you know, these days, you know, you go back to Space Invaders and you're like, yeah, okay, it's that. Like, again, I can play Space Invaders on my TI-83 calculator like right now. But that was fucking critical for the VCS's success, like long term.
Oh, Space Invaders. You can't downplay Space Invaders in the slightest. It's easily the biggest arcade release and possibly most important arcade release outside of Pong.
Mm-hmm.
It really propelled video gaming into the public consciousness. And then after that, of course, being Pac-Man. So like you already have Pong, but like, I'm surprised Pong wasn't a launch game for the Atari 2600. I swear to God, there's a version of Pong on the 2600. There has to be. Like, I swear I've seen it. I swear I've played it. And if I'm Mandela affecting this, I'm sorry. But like, it blows my mind that's not a launch game. It may have been included with Combat, because there's the game select switch that you have on some of the older ones, the Atari units, or most of them for that matter. Because like Combat comes with like technically 27 games that it switches between for some reason. And I've never tried that, by the way, for what it's worth. I don't think I've actually ever played Combat or tried the game select either. So that might be where I'm wrong with this. Yeah, getting Space Invaders, you're 100% right. Going to Taito, and just how Taito just completely was dominating the entire video game market. And you have to think, like, arcades were a little bit different back then. They were more of the older teenagers where they go to smoke, wear their leather jackets, listen to punk music, and beat each other up while getting underage booze. And getting your kids away from that environment where they might be enticed to do that because the cool kids are the degenerates and they might want to be a cool degenerate, keep them out of the arcades. Now they can be like, you don't have to go and smoke cigarettes at the arcade. You can play Space Invaders with grandma.
Who is also smoking cigarettes.
Who's also probably more than the punks at the arcade, probably a lot more drunk. But it was more family friendly, Shane. That's the important part.
True.
You would only get beaten up slightly less.
Oh man. But yeah, I mean, so as far as like other games on the VCS, in my experience, I think that covers a lot of it. There are some that like I said, I think I wish I had experienced earlier, like Tempest for one, just being like one of the first 3-dimensional games for a home system is pretty fucking cool. I'm actually probably glad I did not play Raiders of the Lost Ark, because everything I've seen about that puts it on many people's like hardest games of all time lists, partially because of the logic puzzles that are included and the fact that it's actually like a dual joystick game. Like you use one for movement and one for items. So that kind of blew people's minds in that way at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't know, man. There's another one called Demon Attack that apparently was subject of a lawsuit because of how closely it mimicked certain other vertical shooters. But in and of itself, it's actually a pretty solid game.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you can go on about the Atari. It's something that kind of passed us by. We do look at some of these games with a lot of admiration. I look at some of them, obviously, with a little bit more nostalgia for, other than Shane. By the way, Pac-Man did suck. It was bad. None of us liked it. Yeah, like there's a lot of important releases on here. And yeah, they were arcade conversions, but that's what people wanted back then. Even Nintendo did that with the Famicom. So more advanced games, they get those attention. But yeah, it was still primarily an arcade console. And I think that's what kept people on there.
Yeah, sort of tangentially related to that. But I also just wanted to bring it up because I found it fascinating. Were you familiar with the sort of maybe gray area market of tape cassette games for the 2600?
I am aware of it.
Yeah, I knew nothing about this until I was kind of doing some of the research for this episode today. And like I said, I found this just totally fascinating. So to keep it somewhat brief, there was the ability to essentially take this third-party cassette player. And if you're listening to an episode about the Atari VCS, I hope to God you know what a cassette player is. If not, go Google it, I guess.
Cassettes are coming back.
Yeah. It's like ironically like cool now, I guess. But anyway, there was this cassette player thing that you could basically play games from a cassette. And the way that worked is it converted the data of said game into a sound signal that was then decoded and turned into something that was playable on the 2600. So not only could you play games that weren't necessarily officially made for the 2600 on this, but the adapter, and I'm sure that there were several, but the one that I saw that I learned this about, it also had a little bit of hardware inside of it that actually made the 2600 capable of outputting some better graphics than it would by default. And so, for instance, like there's a cassette version of Frogger that if you do a side-by-side comparison, the cassette version is like far and away a better looking game because it's capable of rendering better graphics than just your stock 2600. But just the idea that somebody figured out that you could record these games on an audio cassette, turn the data into an audio wave, and then hook that into a 2600 and it would be a playable game is just, it's so fascinating to me that like that actually works.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all a magnetic drive.
Yeah.
I mean, they did it for the Commodore as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of like little fun things that the Atari is somewhat known for. It has the first example of having a wireless controller, which was over RF waves instead of IR. And it worked to a degree, from what I understand. I never tried it. From what I understand, like that, because you didn't have to point it at the console, they had some advantages over IR, but some disadvantages were like if people drove by your house at the same radio frequency, you lost the capability to use it. Yeah, it's kind of finicky. Some other cool things that isn't necessarily about the 2600 per se is just all of like the Wild West nature of what was going on back then. If you have a ColecoVision, there's something that you can get called Module 1 that can attach to your ColecoVision, and now you can play Atari games. And Atari tried suing them because obviously they didn't want people to get a Coleco to play Atari games on, and they ultimately ended up losing, from what I understand. So you could play with Module 1 on your ColecoVision Atari games. Not to mention there's like all sorts of various clone consoles.
Oh, yeah.
That came out. So like you had the Telegames, like the Gemini, which all played Atari. They just came out with just different names for these consoles that played Atari games. And I'm not entirely sure their affiliation with Atari, whether or not they were licensed or whether or not they were allowed, or the branding was just through various outlets, because I think the Telegames was exclusive through Sears.
Yeah,
which
it
again,
was.
Google it.
Yeah, well, so the thing, dude. Again, this starts to dovetail into the larger Atari story, but how Atari survived for as long as it did is nothing short of a fucking miracle. Like, the reason that Sears exclusive version of the Atari 2600 even exists is because Atari had to go to Sears. Eventually, they shopped it around, but eventually they got to Sears to basically give them the funding to manufacture the console, because Atari themselves did not have enough money to actually continue production. So like, that was the deal that they struck. That was like, okay, like, we literally don't have the money to make this thing, so we're going to strike this deal with Sears and they'll front the money to manufacture these things on the agreement that this is going to be exclusive to their department stores.
It's nuts, everything that's out there. And that I mean, yeah, Atari was struggling. I don't think a lot of people know that, but Atari was really struggling leading up to the release of the 2600. Like, Warner saved their ass in getting that console off the market. And Shane was right, too, when he said earlier before Space Invaders, it wasn't necessarily a flop, but it wasn't setting the world on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people didn't really care. People just didn't understand video games yet conceptually, which is a different topic, because when you really think about it in terms of video games being accepted as a media as a whole, you could argue didn't happen until about 20 years ago, let alone, 45. So just acknowledging the fact that, they were able to move anything back then and how strapped for cash they were. Because again, like, the arcade market, if you didn't have the arcade hit, I don't think you were making a ton of money. Like, if you didn't have a Space Invaders, if you didn't have a Pac-Man, what were you really doing? And that's where everyone wanted to go to. That was like, there's tons of games that are probably that came out around that time that we don't have a ton of information on, especially if you're Atari. Yeah, you were one of the arcade leaders. You were probably making money, but obviously it wasn't hand over fist, and it definitely wasn't enough to get a console out.
No. And, we, not really in a way, like, we can thank the 2600 for the creation of Activision, for what that's worth.
Oh, before Activision became what they are today.
Yeah. Because there were a number of folks that were working at Atari during this era that kind of broke off and wanted to do their own thing. And so they formed Activision with the sole purpose of basically making 2600 games better than Atari could themselves. So that is why you actually end up with Activision eventually almost owning the entire worthwhile 2600 library. Like, most of the games that people will call out as, essentials,
Pitfall,
are Activision titles.
You know what the irony of all of it was? It was they left because of a labor dispute. They didn't feel like they were being treated fairly.
Huh. That doesn't sound familiar at all. Oh, how the turntables.
I would love to do a deep dive on that someday. I'm not saying I will, Llama. Don't audit me. I'm just saying it'd be interesting to do that.
Now you put it out there now, so there it is.
No guarantees on that. I'm just saying it'd be interesting to do.
One last thing that I did want to touch on is the controllers for the 2600. I would just like to say,
iconic.
As a proud southpaw, a proud left-handed person, that the 2600 joystick controllers are 100% discriminatory, because they do not allow for left-handed people to comfortably use the joystick with their left hand, because the button is on the left. And I just feel like I need to say that.
That's why they gave you the links, Shane.
Oh, great. Thanks. That's what we wanted all along.
The links, it can swap between hands.
Wow. Great.
Yes. It's not ambidextrous. No, it is ambidextrous. That is the word for it.
Yes.
There it is. But what about the paddle controller where you could play like Kaboom and stuff with?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
It's the joystick that I take umbrage with, because it is specifically designed for a right-handed person.
Yeah. Because we dominate the world.
I mean, technically, yes, you do, but it's like the scissors debacle. I spent my entire life thinking that it was supposed to hurt my hands to use a pair of scissors, until I found a left-handed pair of scissors and realized that, no, I've just been getting shafted for like 30 plus years.
Well, I mean, everyone that was with right hand would just use to press the button, but now everyone uses their left hand to like use the directional control, which you'd think would be easy. I don't know.
Don't know.
I'm not left-handed.
Don't try to soften this. No, I'm taking a hard stance against Atari circa 1972 or whatever. How dare you?
You're right. I mean, that is when they started. Shane, I think it's time to introduce our new section. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think it's been a minute, actually, since we've kind of freshened things up. So I'm excited.
So what we are starting here, I don't know what we're officially going to call this. In our Discord server, I call it a penny for your thoughts, which means you give us the penny and your thoughts. We are going to take the thoughts from our patrons that we have in our Discord. So if you want some of your opinions on our upcoming episodes to show up in our shows, just go to our Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You can join our Patreon, which comes with all sorts of special perks. Just head on over there and you can see what those perks are. But one of them is if you're in a Discord, you get to voice your opinion on the upcoming topics that we have for you. And we have some here today. And I will kick this off with the thought from Dischimera, who says, the Atari 2600 predates the time I was even born, but I think it still has games that are fun to play in short bursts. Sometimes a fun game will always be fun regardless of when it was made, and the 2600 is proof of that.
That's fair. I agree with that assessment. Also, throwing it out there for consideration, patron pontifications.
Oh, I like that.
There you go. Let's get that alliteration in there.
Good point.
Next up, we had Ozzy, who says, the 2600 was the first console I played as a kid. Despite it being extremely primitive, it still made an impression. Certainly is an artifact at this point, but especially after going through the Atari 50 collection, it's hard not to appreciate everything that it did for the industry, which is very true.
Our next pontification is from Ray Ray. And he says, if it wasn't for the 2600, I wouldn't have gotten into video games. Once I was able to flip the score in Space Invaders, holy shit, now I understand a lot. I was hooked. We've come a long way since lines and dots, but video game history can't be written without the 2600. Hear, hear.
All right. Next up, we have Randall with his succinct thoughts on the 2600. And that is, as someone who never played the 2600, my opinions are solely on its aesthetic, which is awesome.
Fucking wood grain, baby.
Hell yeah. We need to bring that wood grain back.
The Atari Junior, the Atari 2600, that thing looks like butt. I hate the look of that fucking thing. It looks awful.
It also anecdotally had like a higher hardware failure rate than the original too. So
the Vader looks kind of cool though.
Yeah, that one's all right.
All right. Next is MaskedKeaton, who's auditing us as we speak. He says it was the console my grandma owned. Now I'm thinking about smoking cigarettes, drinking whiskey, and hopefully that didn't happen to you. Hopefully. So once again, it was the console my grandma owned. I played it there a lot. It makes me happy, except for E.T. E.T. hurts. Heck, E.T. to Tartarus. Specific location, but I see where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Not Tartarus. Yeah.
I mean, it made it to a dump, so I feel like that's close enough.
Close.
All right. And rounding out our patron pontifications for this episode, I guess we're sticking with that for now. I kind of like it.
Let's do it. I like it.
Is Keith, the one and only Keith. And he says the 2600 is just outside of my age bracket. And even though I own one and am capable of playing it, it's something I particularly don't want to do. It does look neat sitting on my shelf, though. I mean, that's a fair assessment. I mean, honestly, that's kind of where I was with the thing as well. As you know, it was kind of before my time, but you know, the design of it sure does look neat.
And it's funny, Keith, who, by the way, hosts the Main Quest podcast. I'm in the same position. I also have a 2600 and I have never hooked it up.
Well, you know, you just don't want to shock yourself with those screws.
Yeah, I don't even have the prongs. I have no prongs to hook it into on my TV, and I have a CRT. So like they went away. I know.
That's because TVs don't come with bare ass screws sticking out the back anymore.
Yeah. I don't have dials. I think they only come with the dials. I don't have anything that old. That'd be kind of cool, though. No, can't do it. Nope. So I guess, Shane, this brings us to the end of this wonderful episode and just a discussion over the Atari VCS. But ultimately, we do have to give this piece of hardware a verdict and whether or not it holds up today.
Oof. Okay. Well, guess I'll start with this one. Does it hold up? That's tough. I'm inclined to say no, just because of how dated it really is compared to what most folks these days are accustomed to. I feel like if you go into it with that understanding and you don't have the nostalgia for it, then it holds up insofar as it is still worth a somewhat short amount of time. You know, you'll get some enjoyment out of it. I think you need to pick and choose, because the 2600 library, especially after the whole Activision thing kind of kicked off a lot of third-party development for the console, which would honestly, a lot of it just ended up being shovelware. It became pretty bloated. So there's a lot of garbage that you can find on the 2600. But I think if you do just a little bit of legwork and find like a few of those, like, you know, top 20 best Atari games for the 2600 or whatever, and kind of get a sense of what the quality experiences are, I do still think that you can get some enjoyment out of it. It is not by any means a lost cause, but don't go into the 2600 expecting something that will suck you in and have you enraptured for hours and hours. Because did that happen when it first came out? Absolutely. There was nothing like it. But now, unless you're reliving your childhood through this thing, I don't really see that happening. But can you get a good, like, entertaining, 15 to 30 minutes out of it? Yeah, definitely. So that's kind of a long way of saying it holds up, kind of. I think with some very strong caveats.
I'm going to just be blunt and say no.
Okay, that's fair.
I understand it has a place in history. I don't want to discount that place. But if you're just trying to play it, first of all, is it coming pre-set up for you? That's a thing to consider. Do you have to set it up yourself? Can you find controllers that are suitable for it? Do you want the authentic experience? Because I imagine if you're actually going to want to play the console, you're going to want everything as it was. Mm-hmm. You're going to want an original controller. You're going to want the original console. You're going to want to play it on a CRT TV. And hooking all those things up together at once just to get a 15-minute experience, that's totally not worth it. There are so many other ways to play Atari 2600 games in today's day and era. You could download all of the Atari 26 library for probably less than, 2 megabytes, maybe. Certainly less than 100. So, and that's megabytes with an M, not gigabytes.
I think it could all fit on like a floppy disk.
Essentially. I would have to imagine Atari 2600 emulation is damn near flawless on any computer. Not to mention, as Ozzy mentioned, the Atari 50 collection, which is celebrating 50 years of Atari games, which has a lot of games on there, really good emulation that you should check out if you're into that. That is always available. Just setting it up is too much of a pain in the ass to get a brief amount of enjoyment out of it when there are just every single other way you can play this. No, it won't fill that gap if you're looking to relive that nostalgia of what it was like to be a little kid sitting in front of a CRT TV with dials, maybe even black and white TV for some of you out there, because this still existed when the Atari VCS came out. It had an option, black or white or color, on the console itself. That's how far back we're going. But for almost everybody who's probably listening to this, you didn't have that experience, and there's nothing that you could really do to replicate the authenticity of it. So because of that, I'm going to say no, it doesn't. It's very important, and you should respect it. And it's probably better as a whole than every other clone that any other of its competition that came out around there. Is it better than the Intellivision, the Odyssey 2, the Odyssey, the ColecoVision as a whole? I would say yes, absolutely. Which also means none of them are worth going to either. So there you have it.
Well, I guess we don't need to do episodes on those now.
No, well, we can. I could just tell you again. This has my utmost amount of respect, but it belongs where it is in the past. Find every other way to play the games that are on here. The system itself. It does look dope on a shelf, though. That wood grain is fucking tight. I will say that. That is held up. Bring back wood grain, motherfuckers, you cowards. I don't even know who I'm yelling at.
That's what I just need to. I need to get like a wood grain, like Nintendo Switch or something.
Yes.
The next Switch that comes out, I want an option for wood grain.
Real wood.
That's right. I don't want none of this laminate shit.
No. I want real wood made in America.
I want when my console overheats because it's trying to play a game that was not made for it, that it literally sets itself on fire.
It bends and warps and cracks and give you splinters. If it's not doing that, is it really aesthetically pleasing?
Yeah.
No.
That's a man's console. I want my console to smell like rich mahogany.
No, I want it to smell, when it overheats, I want it to smell like rich mahogany. Yes, you're right, Shane. You are right.
Yes.
When it overheats, I want it to smell like Pall Malls.
Ooh. I thought you were going to say campfire, but no, you're going for that real 80s aesthetic.
Absolutely.
I want that cigarette stank just hanging in that shag carpet. Well, I guess on that note,
after we go to Pizza Hut.
Yeah. The smell of old pizza and cigarettes. Anyway, well, cool. So on that note, hey, you know what? If you're here and you're listening to this and it happens to be your first time that you've stopped by and you've made it this far, then welcome. Hello. We're glad that you're here. We hope that you enjoyed this discussion. If you would like to check out more of what we do, you can do that, and we make it easy for you. All you have to do is go to linktree/retrohangover. That is linktr.ee/retrohangover, and everything it's right there. It's a convenient little button menu. Everything you could ever want that is RHP related, it's all there for the taking. Whether that happens to be this feed itself, or perhaps you would like to check out our YouTube channel, where we post video versions of all of these episodes, as well as our VODs from Twitch, which Chris will fill you in on in just a moment. And we've also got our socials there if you want to check out what we post on Instagram. We've also got other things if you want to support the show in a more concrete fashion and get some sweet bennies out of the deal as a result, then you can head to our Patreon. And we also have a merch store that has been open for a while now, and it's got some pretty sweet designs in there, so you can pick up some stuff to clothe your meat suit should you wish to do that as well. We got all the things. So Chris, what do we do over at Twitch?
So yes, if you head to twitch.tv/retrohangover at Sundays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time US, you can catch us playing a video game of some sort because, hey, what else are you going to be doing at Sunday at 9 p.m.? Getting ready for work? Only losers do that. So stop by the twitch.tv/retrohangover stream where you can communicate with tons of interesting people. By tons, we mean 10, but they are amazing and you will have a good time there. We hope to see you either getting spooked with Shane or being confused and angry and afraid with Chris. Well, different kind of afraid, more of like existential threat. But we hope to see you there at twitch.tv/retrohangover.
All right. Well, I suppose with all of that being said, until next time,
play with your actual, real joysticks. Yeah.
We did it.
Bye, everybody.
Shane here with a quick message. You know, the one rule Chris and I have always gone by regarding advertisements is this. It has to be something we use and can personally vouch for. If you know me, you know I love coffee. And Bones Coffee Company has been my go-to for home brewing for quite some time now. Their small batch beans come in an impressive variety of flavors like Mint Invaders from Chocolate Space, or Electric Unicorn, which I swear tastes exactly like Fruity Pebbles. And the best part? No added sugar or calories involved, just natural flavors infused right into the beans themselves. Build your own sample pack of 5 4-ounce bags to find out which flavors speak to you, or jump in head first with full 12-ounce bags. They've even got K-Cups. Step up your homebrew game with Bones Coffee by visiting bit.ly/RHPBones. That's bit.ly/RHPBONES.